I've got my fabric and I've laid out most of my pieces. I folded the fabric so that I've got the selvage running lengthwise, parallel to my grain line. And I moved over as much as I needed for this to all fit and not get in the selvage part. And then I made sure that the fold was parallel all the way down. And then I made sure that my center was parallel to the grain all the way down, but you know, maybe not. Looks like that needs to move over just a little bit. So I can't move this end out any further, so I'm going to move this end in a little bit. So that's 3 1/4. So I'm going to take that pin out and move that over to 3 1/4 and then adjust that so that it's parallel. And now I have it parallel and I'm going to pin this side down. And then for convenience, I clipped the dart right here so I could fold it inside. And I'm going to trace the pattern off because I don't want to nick it while I'm cutting. So this is all parallel to the selvage, and I want to make sure that I do this with the back side as well. So this is the selvage edge of this side, and it's perfectly straight. And I'm lining that up there, but I want to make sure that it's parallel also, and this side is parallel. I just need to push my center back over and pin that down. And I want to make sure that I've got, so this is what the back looks like. Sorry about that. And my back neck facing, so I'm going to attach those where they belong and trace that off. And then here in the middle, I've got a space that's only one layer, and I only need one layer of these two, but they fit together better if I turned one over. So this is my front armhole facing. I need to make sure that this line is parallel to the folds as well, so I'll measure those before I cut them out. Then I'll need to find another piece of fabric to put 2 layers of collars on the fold and whatever sleeve I'm deciding to cut out. And I'm looking behind that to make sure that there's nothing, because I'm using scrap fabric, and I chose to use scrap fabric that was, instead of muslin, it has a right and a wrong side, so it would be easier for me to show you how to sew it. So I've got the right side folded in and the wrong side out, and I could pin that down, but I'm going to trace around it with a ballpoint pen. And that's something that I picked up when I worked in a factory. We were really careful about not damaging the outer edge of the pattern piece because we wanted to retain that so that it was perfect. And then once the samples were approved, then we could trace that off as long as it didn't have nicks in it and send it down to the grading and marking department. So this is my cut 1 facing, and I could pin that to it so it stays together, but I want to move that out of the way before I pin it because I don't want to accidentally cut it. And then I'm doing the same thing with the rest of this. And you can fast forward if you want to. I'm just going to trace around the whole thing, and then I'll get my sleeve ready and trace around that and my collar pieces. And because I'm not going to choose to sew this dart together for the demonstration, you can sew this dart if you want to. And if you decide to sew it, then that hem is going to be really nice looking. But since I'm not going to sew the hem, that's going to look silly, so I'm going to blend across there. It would have been better if I had done it out of the paper, but I'm going to do the outer edge, I'm going to do this corner, and then I'm going to make sure that this has a right angle. So that actually drops down a little bit, but I'll blend it with the existing curve. That's just going to be what the bottom of my blouse looks like, because I'm not going to do that dart. And if I wanted to trace that dart off, I have two options. I could cut it out so that I could just trace up in there, or I could use my pinwheel or tracing wheel. And, well, I don't know if you can see it, but I can see the dart. I could just outline the dart and mark that through if I want to use tracing paper. So that's ready to cut out. I'm going to be using scissors, and I'll get this side ready. And because I trimmed that dart out, I don't have to worry about using tracing paper. But if you're cutting out a wedding dress or a sheer blouse or something, you're not going to want to use ballpoint pen. You'll want to use chalk or that special disappearing ink or something like that. But for this assignment, tracing around it is just handy. And then you'll do the same thing you do when you cut out your paper. And I could pin that out of the way when I'm cutting too. But you want to cut the line off. And when I'm marking my notches up here, I want to get those 3 notches. But when I come down to the bottom, I'm only going to copy the notch in the middle where it folds, because I don't need the other 2. Okay, so that's where my dart begins and ends. And when I sew darts, sometimes I tend to end them even a little bit shorter and then take a few stitches past. And I'll show you that in the video. And because, so I don't want to cut that out, I've got the dart marked there, but I don't want to cut that out. That's just where I'm going to stitch it, so I'm going to go ahead and fill this back in where it belongs right there. But that's where I'll sew my dart. And before I cut it out, I'm going to put the pin back in so that the fabric holds still. And your sewing teacher might teach you to clip the notch up in there, but I'm going to continue it down. And it would have been easier for me if I had actually used a notcher and trimmed those little notch spots out so that I didn't have to backfill them like that. But they've got their seam allowance on it, it's all ready to cut out, and then I'll line those up and cut those out. So when I cut this, I want to leave it laying flat on the table, and it's going to be, well, I want to be careful about cutting the line off. It would be easier if I was going the other direction. But I can't be spinning my fabric around either. If you want to use a cutting wheel, you could do that. And I give people a bad time in class about picking that up to trim it. When it's small like this, you can get away with that sort of thing. I find it easier to be careful when I'm cutting with scissors than I do when I'm cutting with the cutting wheel. So whichever one you're more accurate with is fine. You know, with practice, the cutting wheel is very handy and your fabric pile doesn't shift. So I'm doing a lot of bad things as I'm rotating it, but it's a small piece, so I'm making sure that it's staying together. And I trust you can do the same thing. I'm also trying to keep it in the picture frame, and if I wanted to move the camera around, then I probably would do a better job of cutting. So make sure you do a nice job. And then I'm going to turn this over, and up here, because I've got these little notches, I'm just going to put a tiny clip that comes in about a 1/16 of an inch so I can see them. And then the other side is marked. I could put a little clip here, and those notches, instead of being right angles, are angled with the dart. And then this notch has a little clip, but I'm going to turn it over and turn this over. Carefully line that back up, and then I'm going to mark the dart on the other side. So I've marked my dart on the wrong side of the fabric because that's the side I'm going to be sewing it on. So I don't need to know where my bust point is, I need to know where my dart ends. So I've got my front ready, I'm going to cut out my back, and while this is still attached, I'm going to measure over and cut out just a single layer of this armhole facing. I'm checking to make sure that that's parallel. And sometimes I think you can see better from that perspective than I can, so that's it. Just less than an eighth. But I measured over where it is at the top, and then I measured over the same place, and I just rotated the bottom part of that. So I'll trace that one. Well, now I'm tracing on the right side of the fabric, but for this facing, that's probably okay. And I can still see to cut that out. So we've got this one already, and my armhole facing. So the reason well now, what about that? That means I could have turned one upside down if I were cutting two of them, but I'm not. That means I'm going to have to cut this one upside down as well, because I'm only making one armhole's worth. So I'm going to turn that over, and I folded that on the grain line so I could see where it was. And I'm explaining what I'm doing, and I'm doing a few things that I'm finding a little odd myself. but I'm hoping that it will make you versatile and know that you don't have to always follow the cut plan that the sewing company comes out with. You can save fabric and refold the fabric in a different way to match your scraps. Because when you're working half scale and doing test samples, you're probably going to want to use up your scraps. Okay, so that's my back facing, and there should be notches marked on here. So I'm going to put a double notch on here so I know that's my back facing, and the front facing either doesn't have a notch or it has a single. And those should match my armhole. Okay, so I'm going to cut those out, and I'll come back with the sleeve and the collar.